Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today's April 25th, 2012, and my guest is David Schmidtz, the Kendrick Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Economics at the University of Arizona and founding director of the University of Arizona's Freedom Center. David, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks for having me on. What a pleasure it is to be here.
Our topic for today is economic justice. We're going to talk about John Rawls, Robert Nozick, and the notion of economic justice generally. So let's start with John Rawls. His book, A Theory of Justice, was published in 1971.
Correct.
Talk about that book.
Oh, well, it begins with Rawls trying to set out a theory of justice, and he sees theorizing about justice as a project of modeling a kind of fairness, like different things can be fair, and evaluation can be fair or not, and shares can be fair or not. So Rawls is giving us a theory about what would make shares fair, and the obvious first thing to say, which is the first thing he says, is that the fair way to divide a pie would be into equal shares. But he said there is, in some theoretical way, another alternative. So suppose that the pie size is variable, and that how large the pie would be in part a function of how we decided to divide it. So different ways of dividing it, and possibly unequal ways of dividing it, would lead to a larger pie, and conceivably could lead to larger and smaller shares, but a pie so large that even the smallest share is something that is a larger slice than an equal share would have been in the of the smaller pie. And so that's the original driving motivation of that theory. So he comes up with a principle of maximizing maximum equal liberties for all, but there's also a principle for distributing. It's interpreted as a principle of distributing goods, of course, but that's not literally what it says. It literally says you distribute inequalities in such a way that even the least advantaged ends up more advantaged than would be possible under a more egalitarian scheme. So that principle is called the difference principle. Distribute inequalities so as to be to the greatest advantage of the least advantaged.
So the ideal would be, if it didn't affect the size of the pie, the ideal would be equal shares, but we're willing to tolerate inequality as long as it improves the well-being of the worst off person.
Improves the welfare of everyone, including the least advantaged.
Oh, including, okay.
Yeah, well, interestingly, the first two statements of that difference principle before 1971 actually said it in that open-ended way, make sure that the inequalities are to everyone's advantage, including the least advantaged. Now, by 1971, he's actually changing his story in a seemingly subtle but in fact momentous way. He says, well, actually there are indefinitely numerous solutions out on that frontier of welfare that would be compatible with that principle, and numerously different unequal distributions that would be good for everyone. So he said, so what we've got here is at best an incomplete ordering principle, and we need something that's complete. And so we have to define a principle that picks out a definite spot on that frontier. So he says, well, let's pick the spot on the frontier that is to the greatest advantage of the least advantaged, so that the smallest share is as large as it can possibly be. Now, that is an intuitively obvious principle to pick. I actually think that is.
If you thought it was crucial to have a a specific outcome, a solution. I mean, it's not clear that that's ideal per se.
Well, that's a good point. And in fact, what I would say is that it isn't the job of this is a basic structure that we're talking about defining, and it isn't a basic structure's job to pick out a particular outcome. I mean, the reason we want a set of traffic management tools and policies, I mean, we want to agree that red means stop and green means go, is that we want to minimize the cost for everyone, including the least advantage of getting to their destinations. So the point isn't to be maximally advantageous. The point isn't to get everyone to the same destination. And you'd think Rawls would not have said that either. He would agree with that. But yet this idea that we need to pick a specific outcome is, I think, a subtle but major turn in a wrong direction. I have to say that the point of basic structures is to put us in a position where we can pursue our own plans in a way that isn't threatening to each other. But to do this is as Nozick is going to come along and say in 1974, that puts people in a position where the rest of us are supposed to think our job in life as people committed to justice, or the job of our basic structure anyway, is to make sure that those other folks out there are made so well off that if the system tried to do anything worse, anything better for them, it tried to do more for them, it would end up being less.
Yeah, couldn't do it.
Nozick says that is just an amazing thing to expect of a system of justice and informing basic structure that is supposed to respect us all as reciprocators and is supposed to treat us all as inviolate, separate persons who come to the community with hopes and dreams of our own.
Of course, not everyone would accept that, but I happen to like that one, and obviously Nozick thought that was crucial.
Yes.
But we'll come to Nozick.
But Rawls did too.
Yeah, well, we'll come to Nozick in more detail in a little bit, but let's still stick with Rawls. Tell us a little bit about him. About Rawls, his background and interests. You mentioned before we started the interview, he hung out with a lot of economists, which I didn't realize.
Yeah, among his friends were James Buchanan and Ken Arrow and William Riker and Amartya Sen. These folks were different generations too, but that was a group of people that formed, these were Rawls's friends and mentors in his discussion group. These were the people that he bounced ideas off of. And so the young Rawls was very much conversant with this developing field, rapidly developing at the time, field of political economy, very much versed in the game theory and the welfare economics of the time. So yeah, very much educated in this and very, very sensitive to it and very, very keen to bring the insights of that field to philosophy, and very successful at bringing the insights to philosophy. He lifted the profession out of a state. To say single-handed would be, historically inaccurate, I suppose, but I think it would be fair to say that Rawls, more than anyone else, kind of broke the equilibrium in which moral and political philosophers were basically saying, there's some kind of dialectic of historical materialism and doesn't really matter. We can't do much about that anyway. As philosophers, it's not our job. Our job is to define terms, or better yet, get somebody else to define terms, and then we can poke holes in their definitions. He who defines a term first loses the game, basically. That was the game at the time, to just think about consistency, not worry about truth, not worry about empirical correlation. So, in effect, not worry about practicality. So philosophy had almost proudly come to a state where it had nothing to say about politics, or ethics for that matter.
Now, one idea that I think a lot of people have heard of from Rawls, and we're sitting in my office doing this interview face to face, and I can't quite see the full section of the R's in my bookshelf, but I once owned a copy of The Theory of Justice. I may still own it. I have read maybe half of it. It's a hard, fat book. It's not easy going, so I appreciate the help. But one idea that I remember, and I think many people have heard of, is the idea of the veil of ignorance. Mm-hmm. Describe what that is and how it entered Rawls's formulation of justice.
It's a hard book for anyone. It's a long book, and it's a very sophisticated book. I mean, he's pulling together a very large number of threads of philosophy and political economy, trying to pull them in and weave a fabric out of them. So it's not your fault. I mean, everybody who takes the book seriously has trouble with it. I mean, it's just full of insight. But if you think about the how we get to that task of dividing the pie, and really the prior task of getting the pie to the table in the first place, which I don't think he does enough to talk about that. He's talking about people as separate agents, separate persons, separate producers, and respecting their separateness in a way that utilitarianism fails to do. And part of my problem is that, he goes on later as he's divorcing himself from the political economist that formed his early discussion group. He's going on to talk about, say, the distribution of talent and saying, well, here's why we would originally go for that semi-egalitarian distribution, that we'd only want to depart from egalitarianism, strictly equal shares, if we could do so in a mutually advantageous direction. The obvious answer would be, actually, I've got talent. I've got something in me. I've got something that I want to bring to the table and I want to bring to society, but I want to be the first person who makes money from it. I want to, Adam Smith would say, I want to be esteemed for this and I want to make money for it. But in any case, the point is, some people say, actually, I have premium talent. As a matter of respecting me as a separate person, I want to be paid a premium price for my premium talent. And Rawls would say, well, that's a problem. I understand the intuition that people deserve to be paid what they're worth. They deserve the marginal product of their creative output and so on. But Rawls says that's not the direction we're going to go in. We're going to go in the direction of this difference principle that starts with equality and only departs from it for the sake of giving everyone a larger bundle of primary goods. So it's not about giving people what they deserve. It's about giving people somewhat better than an equal share. And so he says, this will be more intuitive if we imagine ourselves in a fair situation where we don't come with our biases about how talented we are and how much more we should get paid than the Joneses and so on. So the thing to think about is to imagine ourselves bargaining in a situation where we don't really know where our personal interests lie. So, for example, we may think, shouldn't someone who can throw a baseball 100 miles an hour get paid more than someone who can't? Shouldn't they, in fact, be paid millions of dollars? And you say, well, that isn't obvious, but however we decide that question, let's not let the pitchers decide it, and let's not let even the fans decide it. Let's have people decide it without knowing whether they're pitchers or people who are completely indifferent to the whole sport and would not watch an inning of that game to save their lives. So get everybody in the room, get people representing anyway, every perspective in the room, and have them make that decision in a truly impartial way. So the point of the veil of ignorance is to say to people, what you're supposed to be imagining is, if you don't know who you are, so there's X, Y, and Z, there's some guy out there named Russ Roberts, but you don't know that you're Russ Roberts. How much do you think Russ Roberts should get? And if you decide, here's what Russ Roberts should get, and you don't know that you're Russ Roberts, well, then you're the answer you come up with will be a lot more impartial than if you do know that you're Russ Roberts. So pretend you don't know who you are.
Yeah, it's actually it's using the word impartial reminds me of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, where he often invokes the impartial spectator, a person who's impartial in, say, a dispute between two parties who are angry at each other, or one who's seeking vengeance, or one who's been offended. And since that impartial spectator doesn't have the emotional baggage and the bias of the participants, that's the exemplar we should turn to for how we should behave in that situation. There's something of that in Rawls, right?
Yeah, absolutely. These are certainly fellow travelers in a tradition. I mean, Rawls belongs in more than one tradition, but the contractarian tradition is something that he has links to, and the moral sympathy tradition is something that he has links to. So
now, of course, one of the problems with the veil of ignorance, and you're mentioning James Buchanan brings it to mind, is that there's no such thing as Russ Roberts when you're behind the veil of ignorance. There's no such thing as baseball behind the veil of ignorance. It's an interesting, perhaps, intellectual experiment to say how much should a bricklayer or a blacksmith or a auto worker earn if I don't know whether I'm going to be that person. But of course, we take those as given in the exercise, but of course they emerge through the choices people make and the skills they have, and they all depend on the other skills of the other people. So you can't even say how much should a bricklayer earn. I'll pick a blacksmith. How much should a blacksmith earn? Well, there aren't any blacksmiths anymore. So how does that affect our calculus? Or we could ask the question, well, how much a blacksmith would earn might depend on 1,000 others, millions of other people in the society in 1850 and what their skills are. And so it's an interesting suspension of disbelief, I guess, and requirement of knowledge that, of course, you can't have.
Yeah, so James Buchanan would say we start from here, and I think...
Where's here?
Yeah, well, here is here in the world of Russ Roberts and baseball.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think Rawls would say, well, wait a minute, that's my theory too. I don't disagree with that. But he would say, well, we don't want to start off with our epistemology situated in that world. We still want to come out of this with conclusions that are relevant to the world that people actually live in. But we, in a way, we don't start our theorizing from here. We say, suppose we were starting from nothing, what would we build? Now, if you think about the kind of theorizing we're doing there, that will not have had any point at the end of the day. It'll just have been an idle exercise if we don't come out of it with stuff that applies to the real world of baseball and Russ Roberts.
Yeah.
So when we say we're behind a veil of ignorance, we're not supposed to be imagining that nothing exists, that we're making a decision in a void.
We're in some kind of shrouds or togas as we...
Yeah. But at the end of the day, I'm going to walk out of the door being Dave Schmidtz, but I'm trying to say to myself, if I didn't know that I was who I am, and I didn't know that talents were getting rewarded like that, or I didn't know that I would have talents like that, or I didn't even know that I was particularly willing to take on risk. I knew the general facts of human society. I knew I would know principles of economics and sociology and psychology. But I wouldn't really know anything that had a bearing on making my payoff, the particular payoff that it did. So it really is. It really is a thought experiment. It's not meant to be theorizing about a different world. It's meant to be theorizing about our world, but meant to make us kind of envision what it would be like to be looking at our world impartially.
I think it's a powerful, really thought-provoking idea.
It was the most, probably in philosophy, it was the most provocative idea of the 20th century.
And the book itself, the rest of the ideas, what were its impact? In 1970, one of its impacts is it encouraged Robert Nozick to write a different book than Rawls had written. But how, before we talk about Nozick specifically, what's been the impact of A Theory of Justice, Rawls's book?
Well, it's hard to say. It certainly changed the profession of philosophy, and it probably changed the academy, the social sciences, quite generally as to what has had a larger impact outside of the academy. I'd say there probably hasn't been anything more influential than Peter Singer's conversations about animal welfare and so on, animal experimentation and factory farming. Whereas Singer has had relatively little influence within the academy, but so Rawls has been much more influential inside the academy, I think, by far than any other philosopher in the 20th century. But I think he's really shaped thinking. The thinking was going to evolve and change anyway to what we don't know, but he's taken a profession that had really gone into navel-gazing mode and had started talking about, we're going to define terms and come up with consistent definitions of terms. And he took that and dragged it into instead a state where philosophers were talking hard about what to do about practical affairs. What's the right thing to do? What at least can we single out as deserving to be condemned or something like that? So Rawls had, in a way, relatively little to say about global justice, for example, but he's had many, many students who have gone on to say, well, given that this idea is as striking and intuitive, convincing, compelling as it is, that we should be trying to do as much as possible for the least advantaged, given that the least advantaged are actually on the other side of the world. Do they count? Are they part of this equation? Are they part of the group that we're talking about? Are their advantages on a par with the disadvantages and advantages of the poor in New York or Peoria or Tucson?
Yeah, it's a good question.
So people are working on that now. They're working on it to some degree because of Rawls.
So let's turn to Nozick. 1974. He's a colleague of Nozick's at Harvard, and he publishes Anarchy, State, and Utopia, a book I also once owned. I don't see it on my shelf. You see it? Oh, that's a relief. It's still here, and I have read the whole thing. I read it, I think, when I was 20 or 21, 20. And
the kind of person who would steal that book probably has an inordinate respect for property rights.
What?
I said the kind of person who would steal that book probably has an inordinate respect for property rights. So
why do you mention that?
That's why it's still there.
Oh. I'm not sure what you mean. You're saying no one's wanted and stolen. Well, I don't think anyone stole my theory of justice. It may have, I don't know. Hang on. Let me just eyeball it. No, so I get your joke now. Sorry, I'm slow on the uptake than being the non-philosopher in the room.
Sorry.
So you're suggesting my copy of Rawls has walked, but I suspect I lent it foolishly, and there was some moral complication to that issue. But anyway,
it was assisted walking.
Yeah, right. Could be. But anyway, I was electrified by Nozick when I read it. Of course, I wanted to be also.
It's a great book.
I was on his side. It bristles with creative and interesting ideas, and it is not as, in my view, as systematic as Rawls, which makes it a more entertaining read, but a harder takeaway sometimes as a book as a whole. So, what did Nozick try to do in that book, and how does it relate to Rawls?
Well, I think it's a little bit unclear, might have been a little unclear even to Nozick what he was trying to do. But there are three parts of it, and the biggest second part of the book was more than anything else a response to Rawls. And so there he's setting out an alternative perspective on justice and distributive justice. And so he says, people say that Nozick didn't have any premises or foundations, and that's just not true. But what is true is that he borrowed his foundations from Rawls to a large degree. He said, well, suppose Rawls is right, that people are separate persons with lives of their own to live, and that their utility, it isn't up to somebody else to decide how their utility trades off against someone else's. They have rights, and the aggregate isn't a trump. So maybe that's question begging, but if that's question begging, then Rawls is question begging, because that's Rawls's premise. And Nozick said, suppose that's right. Suppose we took that on board and really believed it. Said, I don't think we're going to get Rawls's conclusions if we do that. I think if we take that conclusion, that premise on board, what we're actually going to end up with is a puzzle about how to justify the emergence and enforcement of a state-imposed rule of law in the first place, but also in an ongoing way. So he comes up with different categorizations of principles of justice, and with the tasks of forming a legal order out of principles of justice. But he distinguishes between historical and patterned principles, and he says that Rawls's theory is actually a patterned principle, based on a pattern principle and the difference principle, that is, whereas Nozick wants us to consider a historical alternative.
Which is?
Well, let me set out the distinction from the ground then. So you might say a principle, he distinguishes between, he uses the idea of current time slice principles, where he says you would evaluate the justice of a situation by looking at a snapshot of the situation and saying, are the shares the right size in that situation? You don't care how the shares got to be that way. You don't care who produced what. You just look at the shares and you say, for example, well, if the shares are of unequal size, then that's that. It's that determines that the distribution is unjust, is illegitimate. And then if you could look at another kind
That's Nozick describing Rawls.
Yeah, in effect. But because
he's saying it doesn't, Rawls ignores how they got there.
Yeah, but he's saying here are the possibilities, basically. And so the two basic categories he wants to talk are historical and time slice, but it's actually a little bit harder and more complicated than that. So you could also distinguish between a more time sensitive or context sensitive principle, which call it an end state principle. That's what Nozick calls it, where you might not exactly take a snapshot and say unequal shares entails injustice. You might say, actually, we should be looking at lifetime income, say, and if the Jones and Smiths have the same lifetime income, then that is equal in the way that justice requires the outcome to be equal. And so even if the Jones and Smiths have different incomes at a particular time or different net wealth at a particular time, because after all, Jones is 20 and Smith is 50, and Smith has been accumulating both talents and skills and connections and wealth for 30 more years than Smith has, than the other has, then that would be inequality and injustice by the lights of a current time slice principle, but the end state principle says, no, that's not the point. The snapshot isn't the point. The whole picture is the point. Now, pattern principles then are principles that say we have to look at a particular pattern. And the pattern might not actually be like slices of a pie. That it might be a pattern of treatment. So you might say, are those people doing worse than others because there's a prejudice against hiring people of their minority group or their religious group or people of their sex. And so you might say, well, that would be where you'd locate the injustice then. You'd say there's a systematic pattern of equality here. Even if people actually had the same income, you might say, well, those people had to work twice as hard for it, or those people had to wait twice as long for it. So there can be a pattern of justice that's a more subtle thing. And Nozick says, okay, well, that's more plausible, but it's still not my theory. It's not a historical theory. My historical theory is that there are rules about how you come to own something. So, and the main question is going to be, did you acquire that by using force? Or did you acquire it by voluntary consent? I mean, if anybody who had a claim to that baseball ticket said, hey, give that to Russ for whatever reason. Maybe he paid for it. Maybe he's just more of a baseball fan or something like that. Maybe it's your birthday. Say, give it to Russ.
Or the current holder's and not a nice person. Or
yeah, well, could be. I mean, lots of different transfer principles we could talk about too. But basically, Nozick said, no matter what the result isn't where the rubber hits the road. The result isn't where the justice question gets resolved. The justice question gets resolved when we look at how the transfer actually occurred, and did the transfer occur legitimately? And Nozick says the preeminent principle of legitimate transfer is consent.
So if you have the ticket and I ask you for it and you give it to me voluntarily, versus I hold you up at gunpoint for the ticket, the second case, even if I'm the bigger baseball fan, is irrelevant because is unjust because I used force. And the first case, even if I'm the smaller baseball fan, is just because you gave it to me.
Yeah.
Or I bought it from you, but it was voluntary. So the problem with that, which I'm sure people have assailed Nozick for, I can't remember if he talks about in the book, is that many of our advantages in life, and this, of course, has become a huge subject of study in economics recently, but many of our advantages in life are given to us. We don't earn them. You know, my children are born in the United States. They're born in the United States of a certain parental endowment of genetics and environment, and the odds are good they're going to be above the median in material well-being. They may not. They may choose a path that's less rewarding materially, but it's certainly open to them to be well above the median if they choose to be. And is that fair? Just because it's voluntary, they didn't steal it from anybody? And what's Nozick's answer to that? With this stress on voluntary exchange versus expropriation.
Well, let me kind of start at the start, if you don't mind. There was
we got at least another half an hour.
Nozick is working in a Lockean tradition, trying to develop an alternative to Rawls's theory, and so Locke is starting out responding to a fellow named Lord Filmer, who basically said all the earth was given to mankind in common. But no, that can't be right, because if it were the case that we all were common owners, then nobody could do anything. We'd all be paralyzed. We wouldn't have the right to take a breath or to stand, even just to simply stand our ground without getting the permission of everybody else in the human race to stand there. So Filmer says that can't be right. And therefore, it must be the case that God didn't give the world to all mankind. God gave the world to Adam, and then Adam passed it on to his children, and that's how it ended up in the hands of Adam's distant descendants, namely today's kings. No, the king.
Sorry,
the king. And so
not us, them.
So Locke made fun of that. He mocked that, but he also came up with a pretty sustained argument against that. Now, Locke didn't talk about us appropriating our talents per se. Mainly what he talked about is appropriating land. But Nozick comes in understanding that we need to have some kind of theory about how we originally become the owners of anything at all. Now, there's this principle which we already talked about. It was a principle of just transfer. So if that ticket belongs to me, the way you acquire property in that ticket is by doing justice to the claim that I have prior to yours. And so you do justice to my claim by asking me if you can have it. And I say, well, what are you proposing? And then you make an offer of some kind. And I say, well, yeah, that'll work for me. And then we make an exchange. And now you're the owner of the ticket. I've relinquished ownership. But if we suppose then that, say, my talents, either my talents came into the world as my property, or my talents came into the world as the world's property, as it were, the human race's property, which actually is more or less like Rawls's theory in the end, but that's what Nozick wants to repudiate. So
Rawls being that it's the world's property.
Yeah. So Nozick basically says what Locke says is there's got to be some way in which we can do things with the world. That if this is supposed to be a theory that has something to do with respecting separate persons, then it's got to have something to do with separate persons having the right to sustain themselves, to feed themselves, with the emphasis on themselves that if they can't even put food in their mouths, then, well, there's nothing respectful about that. There's nothing individualistic about that. That's taking a theory to an extreme that prevents it from ever having anything to do with our world. And so Nozick says, well, we do want our theory to have something to do with helping people solve a problem and live lives in this world. So he says the way we acquire land is by mixing our labor with something to which nobody else has a claim. And that latter part is not a throwaway. That's a really important part of the theory. He's not saying, if I can, run out onto your lawn with a shovel and turn over a few scoops, then I come to own your lawn. It's like the only way for me to come to own your lawn is by coming up with a mutually agreeable arrangement with you. But if nobody has a claim, if you don't have a claim, then the thing that I do when I dig up a mushroom or something like that, or plant a row of carrots, is I am mixing myself with that land, with that product, in a way that nobody else is. And it's not that has to be some extremely strong claim being created. The point is, it's a unique and exclusive claim, and so that the only way for somebody else to come along, the only way for you to come along later and say, I think I'll take some of those carrots, thank you, or I think I'll share that mushroom with you. The only way for you to do it is by ignoring the similar claim that I've made previously. When nobody else has a claim to it, then I'm not ignoring anybody. I'm not mistreating anybody. I'm not failing to respect anyone's separateness. But the person who comes along second needs to get my permission then in order to not be disrespecting me as a person. So it doesn't have to be that strong a claim in order for it to matter that it was the first claim, and that there really would be a disrespect involved, in the same way that any bear understands that, if you get to the territory second, that first bear is going to stand there, and even if the bear is smaller than you, that bear is going to say, I'm going to fight to the death for this, because otherwise I lose my identity. So, even bears understand that it matters who gets there first. And people understand that as well. So the thing about your talents is, in a way, it's very implicit in Nozick, but implicitly the idea is that nobody else, I can exploit my talents. I can make use of my talents without making anybody else worse off, without putting anybody else in a worse position. But nobody else can come along and commandeer my talents, can enslave me, for example, without mixing their labor with something that I do think of as mine, and I quite reliably, predictably will think of as mine, and that you can't really nobody can really avoid thinking of as mine. If we talk about it at all, we will talk about it as mine.
So now Nozick, of course, gets into the appropriate role of the state and he comes down, if I remember correctly, arguing that, and I have to confess, although I found that exhilarating at the time, thinking back on it, I find it a little less exhilarating in terms of its elegance. But his argument is that because of economies of scale, that the state has the authority or justness of performing the police function. But I want to step aside from the many things we might argue or discuss what the state could do and just focus on the one, which is redistribution. So if the state raises taxes not for revenue purposes, that's what I want to push to the side, but merely to redistribute income. So we've got these baseball players who can throw a baseball 100 miles an hour. We have people who are endowed with great voices who can entertain and make millions of dollars a year as a result, like the baseball players, actors and actresses who are good looks. And I'm going to put aside, I'm going to accept the fact, and I think this is important. Obviously, Nozick thought it was very important, but all these people work very, very hard. There's a great, when you talk about your talents, there's a tendency to talk about talents as an endowed gift. Some part of it is, obviously, but what a modern athlete has to do to be a successful earner of those high returns is unimaginable, I think, to most casual sports fans. I don't think they realize the amount of work that gets put in, the relentless effort. I'll put a clip up attached to this of one example of this very, very moving and I think informative about this. So taking that as a fact that some people can throw a baseball faster, sing better, have faces that are in demand for whatever reason, and that they've combined hard work to get there. Is it unjust then to take a larger share from them, to take a share from them and give it to others against their will, merely to push the distribution of income toward that egalitarian equal share outcome? And the question I want to ask is, I know what Nozick's answer is. Nozick's answer is no. But the average American, when confronted with the veil of ignorance, what do you think that person would say? It just seems to me they're just two orthogonal theories. I mean, Rawls, would most people, not you and I, would most people say that, well, behind a veil of ignorance, I don't know if I'm going to be one of the gifted ones who works hard or one of the gifted ones who squanders talent. I might end up being one of the non-gifted ones. I might have an IQ of a low number and be endowed with a lazy temperament, and I'm not going to live very well. And I might be a gifted person with tremendous drive, a Michael Jordan or Steve Jobs, and end up with multi-millions. Would most people, where would justice lie there in the minds of an average thoughtful person?
Well,
would they find redistributive taxation offensive or admirable?
Yeah, there's so two perspectives on this. One perspective would be that on the one hand, look at that pitcher who is excelling now. That pitcher is the one who did something to make something of himself, make something of his talent. So, like you say, the labor is really there, and even some folks on the left, like David Miller, will say the point wasn't whether the pitcher or Wilt Chamberlain worked extremely hard or took extreme risk. The point is there was a certain amount of work that went into it, and the work that went into it was, after all, work that Wilt did, not work that somebody else did. And so that is the thing that establishes Wilt's presumptive claim. It doesn't mean that he shouldn't be taxed for various purposes mainly, but it does mean that Wilt is the one that has such claim of justice that has anything to do with, say, with being deserving or merit or investing in creating the talent, bringing the talent to the table. So that's one perspective. Now the counterpoint to that is a person who will say, well, yeah, but in a way, you're failing to understand the extent to which the communities involvement goes all the way down. So it isn't just you that worked, it's your parents that worked, and it's your grandparents that worked, and actually your parents' employers, your parents' teachers, your parents' grocers, your parents' cab drivers.
Sure.
So all of society worked to put you to be in the situation that you're in. Okay, so that's one perspective that is probably, that leaves us with a real understanding of why people would disagree about this, why it would seem quite intuitive. Both sides of that debate would seem quite intuitive. Now, the only thing that I would want to add to that is I would say, okay, but let's remind ourselves, are we talking about a liberal society or not? Are we talking about a society that is
supposed to... You use the word
to,
liberal, you mean classically liberal or modern liberal?
Ambiguous between them. Just a theory that believes that an individual is a real thing. It's not a scholarly, fictitious construct or something like that. There really are people in the world, and people really do have their own hopes and dreams, and people really aren't mere pawns. They actually are agents taking responsibility and making decisions. Now, you can say that, well, wait a minute, at the end of the day, society owns people. People don't own themselves. Well, you can say that and probably say that consistently, but you're not saying something liberal when you say that. So at the end of the day, for a liberal, you have to make sure you're on the wrong side or on the right side of this question. When somebody says, okay, I got it. I realize that I wouldn't be where I am today without my teachers and cab drivers and parents and all kinds of other people. But I don't like this deal. I'm going to go home now, if you don't mind. I'm going to leave the country, perhaps, if you don't mind. Who gets to say, sorry, you aren't enough of a self-owner that you don't have a right to say no? Maybe we want your kidney, maybe we want your blood, maybe we just want your labor, maybe we want to restrict what you can do by laboring for yourself and your family. And at some point we say, well, let's be reasonable and let's go along with this to some extent. But still, there's a fundamental matter of principle, a question that needs an answer at the end of the day, which is, do I have the right to say no? Do I have the right to walk? Do I own myself? Right? So the fact that you can think of other people who helped me, or you just imagine, how do you know that I'm not an orphan? But maybe you're in your imagination, all kinds of people helped me. Tell me at what point other people helping me made me your property. Because if there was no point at which I became your property, then excuse me, but I'm going to go home and I'm going to take all my toys with me. If you want some of my toys, if you want me to share my toys, treat me like an adult, treat me like a self-owner, and make me an offer. And you might make me an offer that I'm perfectly willing to accept. I might say, and this was the thing you were excluding, I might say, yeah, I want to be part of a community. I want to be a community that has a real infrastructure. In fact, I want to be part of a community where the roads are free. Not that I think that anything is really free. I realize that I, as a taxpayer, will be paying for the free roads.
But I don't want them charged.
But the point is, I want to minimize transaction costs because I want it to be as cheap as possible for my customers to get to my store. And so I would rather pay for that in part of my taxes than have to put up a toll road or something like that and have my customers have to pay to get to me. So yeah, I want public goods. Even things that aren't inherently public, as most public goods
so-called
aren't.
Public goods, yeah.
Yeah. So I want all of that. I'm willing to pay for it. I regard my paying my share for it as a way of respecting me as a separate person. I'm in. You want me to fight for my country and maybe get killed in the process? I hate the thought, but I'm in. I realize, that sometimes my share is going to be big, but so I'm in for my share. Now you say I should also be willing to regard myself basically as somebody else's property. I should regard my talent as belonging to someone other than me. I say, no, if we've gotten to that point, I want to get on a plane with a couple of suitcases and my talent, and I want to go someplace where I'm treated with more respect. And if you're going to stop me, then we've stopped being a liberal society. If we're still a liberal society, then you realize this package of talents is mine.
So,
no matter where it came from, no matter how many friends I had or teachers I had, this is my package of goods.
No matter how many public schools you attended, and I'm fighting off the urge just to end the podcast here because that was so eloquent. So I want to continue. Let me take a different approach at the question. We could make a different set of arguments against progressive taxation. So there was a wonderful book. I'm also looking up my shelf. These are all a testament to these comments about my bookshelf are testament to my eyesight, the clutter in my room, and the height of my bookshelves. But Bloom and Calvin, two law professors, wrote a wonderful little book a long time ago called The Uneasy Case for Progressive Taxation, where they tried to lay out an argument in favor of progressive taxation. And they made a bunch of different ones, and they shot them all down, most of them. And they said, I think the book concludes that the case remains uneasy. They're sort of pro-progressive taxation, but with a little bit with qualms is how I might describe it. So let me make three arguments, if I can remember them, against, not from their book, but I remember from me sitting here talking to you, against progressive taxation. One would be, it's unjust. It's immoral. That's a Nozickian argument akin to what you just made, that you own yourself, you own your property, and taxation, especially for the purpose of redistribution, is theft. The second argument would be it's inefficient. It makes the pie smaller. And this would be a Rawlsian argument. So Rawls, while in favor of progressive taxation, would say eventually, well, I'm in favor of progressive taxation, but not to the point where it makes the pie so much smaller that people get smaller shares. The third argument against progressive taxation I would call practical, a different kind of practical. And I guess deep down, it's the third argument that I find most compelling, both intellectually and in terms of persuasiveness, as I think about an impartial spectator thinking about our arguments, conversations here. Third argument would be, well, if I give the state the power to tax people, that power will be abused because John Rawls is not going to be the commissioner of taxation in this society. And if he is, he's going to end up being somebody different than a Harvard philosopher. He's going to be a commissioner of taxation, and he will be subject to the imperfections of humanity and the special interests that will try to sway him. So when I think about, to speak more generally about limiting the power of the state, and these three arguments, I think, work for so many issues. Think about the minimum wage, or, the minimum wage is, you can argue it's immoral. The state has no right to talk about what I can earn or pay. You can argue it's ineffective. It doesn't do a good job in helping the people it's intending to help. Or you could argue, well, when you give the state the power to set wages, it's going to do more than that. We're going to be on the road to tyranny. So if you think about those three arguments, and this going back to redistribution, I find myself strongly drawn to the fear of tyranny. It may be I'm not, because I'm not behind a veil of ignorance. I'm sitting here earning well above the median, and I have a very good life. I live in the United States, which puts me way ahead to start with, and many, many gifts and blessings, and many of them I've worked for, but many of them, as we said earlier, came to me. When he asked me, so when I think about it, I think, well, I have kind of a conflict of interest in thinking about this. So I've put myself behind the veil of ignorance. My biggest argument against taxation for purely redistributive purposes is that I think that puts you on a road to a very destructive political system. What's your reaction to that? It's like sorry about the length and complexity of
No,
the thought.
that's fine. It's a rich question. Gave me a chance to think for a minute, but well, first of all, your last thing, bias is a real issue. We're scholars and we're academics, so we both have a moral obligation to be as impartial as we can be and to be lovers of truth. And it's really hard. We're only human. There are lots of the ways that our minds work and gather information. They're inescapable, and we wouldn't be better off if we could escape from them. We process bits of information one at a time, and the first bits of information we acquire are going to become the defaults, and it's going to take more energy and so on and evidence to overturn those defaults, and that results in bias. We can't do anything about that. So it's an issue. I mean, 2/3 of my salary comes from the state. So, there's a built-in dynamic leading me in the direction of being a statist.
And instead you bite the hand that feeds you, as do I, so often.
Well, yeah, I guess...
that hand that's doing the feeding doesn't realize it's being bitten. That's part of the problem, but that's another issue. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, Freud would have an explanation. He'd say, I'm getting back at my parents or something, something like that. So, I'm sympathetic to all of these arguments. That there certainly there comes a point when either the amount of taxation or the form and rationale for taxation becomes so egregiously insulting and threatening that you're pretty much willing to go to war, to start a revolution, to create a new country, if that's what it takes, in order to make a stand against that injustice. So I'm sympathetic to that. I'm an immigrant. I'm a naturalized American citizen now, and I believe in the principles of the revolution. But at the end of the day, there's still an issue for me that as a philosopher, that's more like a premise than it is like a conclusion. I can say, here's where I make my stand, and my colleagues can say, me, not so much. Yeah. And I can say, I don't blame you. There's no particular reason why you have to agree with me on this. So we can all be brothers until you come around to collect your share of my paycheck. But I can see why reasonable people would disagree with this. So so these, table thumping, deeply compelling emotional beliefs about justice and injustice, they don't make great premises for arguments. They're better as conclusions. If you can get them to come out of your arguments, that's interesting. But if you just insist on them, not so interesting. The efficiency thing, I think, is, we're on your turf when we talk about that, and I believe that's a really important issue as well. And Rawls, as you say, that is a Rawlsian argument to say, there are people in the world, not to name names, but they'd say it would be worth making the 99% worse off if we could just nail the 1% to the wall. Absolutely. And finally get our revenge on all those hoarders and greedy, the people who hog most of the nation's wealth. That's not neat. That they produce anything. The way they acquired their wealth was by hogging it, not by creating it.
Yeah, so that's Nietzschean ressentiment, which I don't get to say very often at EconTalk. So I thought I'd just throw that in. My college philosophy class pays off finally.
Ressentiment. Yeah, I've read about that for many. I'm not sure I've actually attempted to pronounce that word before. Certainly not on the radio.
It's a 6.5, maybe a 7 on the quality.
Yeah, Nietzsche is. You got points for Nietzsche. Now the practical thing, your third alternative. Actually, I think that is the main concern that I have too, and in a way. Maybe we're all children of James Buchanan now to some extent, but I look back and I see it in Hayek. I look back and you can see it in Adam Smith. You can even see glimpses of it in Aristotle. But I think that concern and that awareness that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that has been with us. We've been aware of that concern for many, many centuries. And the idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that isn't just a kind of cute way of taking a point to its logical extreme. I think it actually is a relevant dynamic of real world corruption that, well, the more power there is available, the more that power is worth, the more it's worth to acquire that power. And so the more people will invest, and the more unscrupulous they will be in doing whatever it takes to acquire that power, the more they will be willing to spend as well as to lie in order to acquire that power. So it really is, I think there really is a powerful reason to take at the reason, like Hayek would have said, to take the reasons we have every step of the way. There's always a reason, even a good reason, to create more power. There's always a problem coming up that hasn't been solved, where we think we need a czar or a committee or an agency, we need a cabinet to solve that problem. I mean, like, the reasons for doing it will probably never be without weight, without merit. And yet the result of creating more power in order to solve that problem is you create more power that gets bought and sold and auctioned off to the highest bidder, in effect, and used for whatever purposes that high bidder has in acquiring that power. So it ends up being, the bills come out, not to name names, but bills come out with certain, nice sounding names on them. And then you actually read the bill and it will be 4,000 pages that have nothing to do with the thing that forms the title of the bill. And literally nobody has ever read the whole thing. Even the people who wrote it. Yeah. None of them, there's 435 members of Congress, each threw in a few pages. So even the authors of the bill don't know what's in the bill. They just know, well, I've got something I can take back to my primary donors and my constituents and so on. I can say, see, I've done what will warrant you in reelecting me, or in putting me on your board of directors so that I can get $100 million payoff after I retire from the Congress or the Senate. So you've got that kind of dynamic going. And so, even good purposes give rise to corruption. Well-meaning purposes give rise to an increasing level of corruption. And as a country gets older, as its bureaucracy gets bigger, I'm sorry, but it escalates, and it starts growing, if not exactly exponentially, but at least in episodically, there'll be periods of exponential growth, and growth and emergence of new forms of power that would have been imaginable a generation ago will be accepted as, well, just the next little step. That if we didn't object to the previous step, it doesn't make sense to pick this as the place to
boiling the frog.
It. But so, yeah, that's I guess that's the metaphor. But that is my main concern as well. Is just that power is not going to be used for the purpose for which it was ostensibly created. It's going to be used for the purposes that the person holding that power currently has.
Yeah, I think back to a podcast a few years back with Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, where he talked about King Leopold of Belgium, who was popular among the Belgian people at the time for some of his social policies and legislation, where he was constrained by a parliament. But in the Congo, he was unrestrained, and he murdered millions of people, I think millions, certainly hundreds of thousands, and took booty and plunder. And Bruce, I think, very eloquently asked the question, which was the real King Leopold? And we know the answer is the one who was unconstrained. Not a pretty picture. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a real issue. What it brings to mind, though, which fascinates me, I hadn't thought about it enough, is that interaction between the political system and the economic system. And Rawls kind of abstracts from it. Nozick is cynical is not the right word. He's not romantic about democracy. He has that extraordinary passage, the parable of the slave, which I recommend to everybody. I don't know if I can legally put a link up to it, but I'll try to, and you can certainly Google parable of the slave. You'll find it written Nozick, and you'll find versions of it up on the web. Nozick, for many people, became the foundation for libertarian ideas and policies. But Nozick himself changed his mind to some extent toward the end of his life, correct?
That is correct, yeah. I actually can explain that. I only met Nozick once, so I was not, really familiar with him as a person. But in December of 1999, Boston University invited me out to give an end of millennium talk, and I talked about the meaning of life because it seemed like, what else are you going to talk about at the end of a millennium? So
that talk is in print, correct?
Yeah, it is.
It's a beautiful essay.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's on my website, but
we'll put up a link to it.
Oh, thank you. So I was coming out to give that talk, and Nozick sent me a note and said, "That's interesting. Would you be interested in having dinner afterwards?" And I said, "Well, absolutely. I mean,
I guess so.
What else would I rather do? Yeah, this would be a dream of a lifetime for me." I knew that he had a recurrence of his stomach cancer. I did say my wife will be with me, who was a biochemist, and there weren't search engines back then. But
they weren't very good. Yeah,
he had somebody track down some of her articles on insect biochemistry, and he said, "Well, please bring her along too." So we showed up for dinner, and he had all kinds of questions about insect biochemistry, and they were smart, cutting edge questions. I mean, so that was people talk about Nozick, and they say, "Well, he was the smartest person I ever met," and I'm not sure I know enough about him to say that off my own bat, but he was really stunningly impressive, I have to say. And it wasn't because he was trying to make an impression. He was just interested in everything. And he had good questions about everything. But then he turned to me and, well, I wish he had all kinds of questions about my work, but he didn't. He said, "I want you to know that my departure from libertarianism has been greatly exaggerated." And I said, "Well, you don't have to prove anything to me." I said, that isn't on my mind. I'm not worried about that. So, whatever you were, or whatever you are, I don't care. I'm just enjoying dinner. And he said, "I want to explain." I said, "Well, no, if you want to explain, please explain." And he said, "Okay." So I published this book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And then I started thinking about symbolic value, and I started thinking about what countries stand for, what they symbolize. And I started thinking that this thing that I had said in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, like if someone wants to sell himself into slavery, and it really is genuinely his rational best option, like he can save his daughter's life by selling a kidney, well then why not let him sell a kidney? And maybe it takes more than a kidney. He has to sell himself, his person, into slavery. And he says, "Hey, if that's what it takes to save my daughter, there's no question.
Amen.
No reticence on my part, no even sense of self-sacrifice on my part. It's just, there's nothing I'd rather do with my life than save my daughter with it. So yeah, I want to sell myself into slavery." Nozick said, if somebody is in that position and wants to do it, who are we to interfere with that person? So Nozick said, well, I said that in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Now fast forward, and I'm thinking about symbolic value. And I'm thinking, okay, countries don't just do things like defend freedom or not, or secure freedom or not, secure freedom of contract or not. They also stand for things. And at some point, America is supposed to be the kind of country that doesn't just defend freedom, it stands for freedom. And I thought, if this is going to be a country that stands for freedom, allowing the emergence of a class of slaves, that's not a really impressive way of standing for freedom. In fact, it's not a really successful way of standing for freedom. And so he said that I came to the conclusion that it matters what a country stands for. And so even though this is in a truncation of freedom of contract and the sacrosanct status, individual status of contractors, he said, I came to think there's a separate importance to standing for freedom. And in view of that, I gave up on the idea that people should be allowed to sell themselves into slavery. Even voluntary slavery just isn't a way of standing for freedom. So it's out, period. Even when it's the only way for a guy to save his daughter's life, it's still out, period. It's an unconscionable contract, cannot be enforced. Of course, people can say, look, I'll do whatever you want if you save my daughter. Of course, they can say that. But that guy can't go to court and sue and he said he'd do whatever he wanted. I want him to,
be my serf.
Yeah, do these degrading things, whatever. So that's what Nozick said. And he said, well, that was my conclusion. And he said, but then this other thing happened is my landlord was Eric Siegel, author of Love Story. So I found out that my apartment was rent controlled, and I went, and he'd been raising my rent every year. I mean, reasonable, but significant. My rent had gone up, and then I found out that those rate hikes were illegal. So I went to them. I said, I realized that, hey, I'm rent controlled, so that actually wasn't legitimate. And he said Eric Siegel actually waved a copy of Anarchy, State, and Utopia in my face and said, "You've abdicated the right to complain." And Nozick said, "No, I haven't." Siegel said, "Yes, you have."
And I think the New York Times thought he had it.
Nozick said, I can prove that I haven't abdicated that right. I'll see you in court. So he sued him, and he won. And Eric Siegel had to repay the back rent from the rate hikes. And so then my colleagues started.
And then he got publicity about this.
Yeah, and my colleagues were slapping me on the back and saying, "Way to go." And then your stuff came out saying you now have serious reservations about libertarianism. People were saying, "Yeah, you're so smart. I knew you'd come around. I knew you'd grow up. It was just a phase you were going through." And Nozick said, it was a moment of weakness on my part, but it was so nice for people to be slapping me on the back and telling me that they had faith in me and they believed in me and they had a lot of respect for my intelligence and so on, because they hadn't been saying that for years. And they started welcoming me back into the fold. And he said, God help me, but I just liked to not be vilified for a change. I like to not be, a pariah in my own department. So I went along with it, and I could have done the sort of snarky thing and said, "No, your approval of me is based on a misunderstanding." He said I could have said that, but I just didn't. I was tired, and I just let it go. But he said, in fact, it was just about slavery. That was my genuine, serious departure from, my youthful libertarianism. But he said, that's about it. He said, other than that, I haven't changed much. So that was my conversation with Bob Nozick. He was delightful, I have to say. We talked about other things as well. I mean, that guy, he could talk. But he was also very interested in everything. He was a great listener as well. He was a delightfully gracious human being.
Well, we were going to talk about Rawls for about 20 minutes in my mind and Nozick for about 20, and then we'd spend the last 20 starting to explore some other ideas related to justice. But I see we've managed to go over an hour, and we have plenty more we could talk about with Rawls and Nozick. So I think we'll stop here, and hope we can come back and address some other issues related to justice and inequality another time.
Well, thank you so much, Russ. It's been great to talk to you. I really appreciate your time and appreciate your having me on the show.
My guest has been David Schmidtz. David, thanks for being part of EconTalk. This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.